Good afternoon. If we could start taking our seats. My name is Seung-Chan Ra. I'm on the faculty here at North Park Theological Seminary. Grateful for those who've made it to the final session, the last session for us here during the symposium. In the Korean tradition, the last session of a retreat is the most important. It's when the altar call is made and the people fall over in confession and prayer. So we're going to maybe not have that here, but this is also a very important session. So we're thankful for your attendance here for this 8th session. Our paper is being presented by Dr. Jodie Boyer Hatlem. She is a teaching fellow with us here at North Park Theological Seminary from the Louisville Institute in Theology. And the response will be given by Alexis-Baker, who is a PhD candidate at Marquette University.
Thank you. Everyone has started by expressing their gratitude for being here. And I've kind of embodied that in my paper itself, so you can hear it there. I want to begin by explaining the importance of a particular logical construction in my paper, necessary but not sufficient condition. It appears in the thesis. For the purpose of this symposium, I will argue that the necessary but not wholly sufficient ground for the human encounter with God is a cry for justice. It appears in the body. Life is a necessary but not sufficient condition of hearing the commands of God, and this life always includes a social element. And it is involved in my assessment of Novak, who I write. Novak insists that Scripture includes certain basic forms of sociality that are necessary but not sufficient conditions for hearing revelation. What do I mean by this? I think I would like to start by saying the sufficient condition for me being here today can only be the divine initiative, both through creation, whereby my life is entirely contingent and dependent. There is not an act of will whereby I can ensure the drawing of my next breath. And I realize that I'm taking a chance in saying that. Also, I am here talking at a seminary in no small part because of God's entirely surprising act of calling me to himself. Neither of my parents were Christians, and that I started attending the church at the age of 3 is just the kind of utterly surprising, impossible possibility that God's grace and initiative is always enacting. But there is also necessary but not sufficient human conditions for these things. The necessary condition for my drawing breath is the very human space of my mother's womb that made space for me. The necessary condition for my encounter with God was the rickety old bus of the Buckley Gospel Tabernacle, where God's strange invocation of grace came to me through the flawed and yet holy lives of the saints of God in Buckley, Michigan, who did the entirely unreasonable thing of taking a 3-year-old each week on a church bus just so they can sit in the nursery. The sufficient condition of my giving a paper today is ultimately also, I believe, that God has called me to serve him and has allowed me to draw breath. But the necessary condition is Klein. All right. Klein was asked to be my mentor when I came to serve as a postdoc for 2 years. Surely that he invited me has something to do with his faithfulness to his commitment to me as his mentee. This is not to say that Klein invited me out of some empty sense of obligation because he had to. Klein has never for a moment taken his mentorship as a mere formality. He has from the beginning treated me with not an ounce of condescension. And that is a surprising thing in the academy, I'll let you know. Being my mentor didn't require that he become a friend, but he really is, and I'll just say that friendship across differences of gender and age is a beautiful thing. And it has created new potentials in me as a scholar and mentor. Now, Paul has cried already here, talking about Calvin of all things. So if I cry here, it'll be all right, right? Yeah. I want to say in a larger sense, though all of us presenters are here because Klein has asked us to be, right? The necessary but not sufficient ground of this entire meeting is Klein Snodgrass and the community here at North Park that has made his really beautiful life of faithfulness and excellence possible. It is my understanding that Klein, when he first came here, was a bit of a bolt out of the blue. He was brilliantly gifted biblical scholar, not ECC, and a bit out of place. Others with Klein's gifts could have seen North Park Theological Seminary as a stepping stone for something bigger and better. Klein gave himself over to enriching this place. Just from my perspective, it's hard to imagine that any of us would be here this afternoon at this symposium if it wasn't in some sense in response to Klein's own particular call to doing biblical studies theologically for the church. His faithfulness to this has opened up for each of us gathered here a form of freedom and possibility. His faithfulness is a necessary but not sufficient condition for our particular acts of faithfulness in writing our papers. Through his faithfulness, he has opened up spaces for us all to be more faithful. I have probably really embarrassed Klein by now. But his life is so good for illustrating my paper's logical structure, I am going to make one more comment. There are others here for whom Klein's faithful work is a necessary and not sufficient condition. There are so many women here who are living out a beautiful vocation that finds its sufficient condition only in God's call, but at least one necessary human condition is Klein's faithfulness in crafting the ECC's biblical position on women in ministry. And now we will have an altar call. Thank you. Or at least an acknowledgement. All right, so the rest of this it's boring enough that I'll get through without all this emotion. I am a Mennonite, and while we are sometimes impugned for our lack of attention to the wholly sufficient and ultimately sovereign power of God to save, I think we, along with Wesleyans and Pietists, bring theological attention to these human preconditions. I am sure that Snodgrass is ultimately only a sinner of God's redeeming, and yet, in his attempt to follow faithfully his God, he has lived a life that has opened up spaces for the creativity and moral beauty of his mentees, his students, and his fellow scholars. And let me just say, there are literally hundreds of different ways to live a life that is faithful as a scholar for the church, but I suspect that each of these instantations, there would be some patterns of similarity with the life that Klein has lived. I think a charitable view of this paper that I've written is that I am attempting to think through some of these necessary but not sufficient grounds of the human hearing of the divine command. I've been trying to think about what this claim might mean in light of Barth's beautiful statement that the law is the form of the gospel. Centrally here, the idea is that to some degree, law is a necessary but not sufficient ground for hearing about the grace of God. Implicit in this is the recognition that for Jews, as well as Christians, the only wholly sufficient ground for salvation is God's power and gracious gift. And that the only sufficient ground for the event of divine revelation is the word of God which comes to us and which we cannot coerce. And yet, let us not completely forget that there is all kinds of space for faithfulness and moral beauty. The law is the form of the gospel. I remember when I first encountered these words. I was in Stanley Hauerwas's Barth class, and I was reading through 2:2. I was thrilled by Barth's portrayal of the human encounter with divine revelation. I wrote this following sentence for a paper which I was inordinately proud of. Divine command cannot be a norm which is casuistically applied. As soon as it becomes such, it loses its freedom to speak a loud no to human pretensions. For Barth, I would say the divine command is always the nomos of a people wandering in the wilderness. The word of God is like manna, and it is a sin to take more than one day's supply. Any attempt of preservation of commands in the forms of law, legalism, will always involve the rot of unfaithfulness. And then I found this phrase, that the law is the form of the gospel. And I tried to figure out what it meant. And one of the first things I found was an article by a Jewish scholar, David Novak, which included the following question. Does Barth adequately deal with the communal character of the commandment of God? Novak then asked another intriguing question. How could we know what a commandment is if we have never had any experience of a commandment before the event of revelation? I found this to be a question that I simply couldn't answer. As an emerging Mennonite, I appreciated Novak's critique of Barth, especially his argument that Barth does not take seriously enough the communal aspects of hearing God's command, these human preconditions that are necessary but not sufficient. Novak asked whether Barth ever accounts for the radical spatiality, historicity, and temporality of revelation to humans. Novak insists that to hear a command from God across time together requires what Barth so clearly forbids, the articulation of commands in the forms of precepts, norms, and propositions. Could a failure to do so, he asked, be part of the reason that Barth can never fully account positively for Jewish law-keeping? I read Novak with rapt attention at this point. What was he going to say next? But then Novak went on to say, natural law governs who we need to be with. It prepares us for God's covenantal entrance into our community so that transform it without destroying it. No. No, 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 9. I would not and could not go there. If there's anything that I was certain I absolutely shared with Barth, it was his rejection of natural theology. A couple years later, I found myself at the University of Toronto in Novak's class on natural law in Christianity and Judaism. Here I was all Barthian 99999 about Novak's claims about natural law. In retrospect, this was kind of funny, as I was a lone Christian telling a group of Jews that natural law was a problematic form of universalism. I remember one day coming early to class, and Novak was engaged in a conversation with one of the rabbis attending the class. And the topic of the conversation was me. And the focus of the conversation was, why is she so against justice and rationality? Novak came to my defense with, oh, she is just a Calvinist. They are like this. Yet as the year progressed, Novak started to move my thinking at least a little bit in several ways reflected in this paper. First, he made me recognize that natural law was not necessarily the same thing as natural theology. That natural law, if understood as a form of reasoning from the Bible, from Scripture, from special revelation, from Torah, and not a way of reasoning to revelation, did not require a claim that humans had any direct, unmediated access to God via creation. Secondly, Novak insists that any sense of natural law or justice, if it's understood in a faithful Christian Jewish way, must be implicit and not extrinsic to the nature of God. He would often compare God's creation to the work of an abstract painter, for whom They are not looking at a beautiful vista or a fruit as some form for what they're doing. Not some extrinsic piece, extrinsic standard that they're placing from the outside, but that God's creativity, like an abstract artist, emerged implicitly out of the creative activity itself. So the natural law and justice might be implicit to the nature of God. Thirdly, the Noahide law, which in rabbinic tradition includes 7 very basic commands, including do not murder and do not commit adultery and do not steal, can function differently from other forms of natural law thinking precisely because of its location in a revelatory history and the specifically post-fall location of these commands. And this was important for me with my somewhat Calvinist Bardian hang-ups, because I think he gave me the sense that the commands given to the children of Noah do not presume that we must get behind the fall. Concepts of the order of creation always bring with it the temptation of postulating a law more determinative than the ones we know through the instruments of God's salvation, either Christ or the Torah. These 4 points made me at least provisionally open to the claim that some understandings of justice might be necessary but not sufficient conditions of hearing revelations, if revelation is understood as a communal historical event and not just a word, some sort of synthetic a priori addressed to an individual. Because God gives commands in a history of revelation that is also real history, then there is real possibility for some forms of moral agreement between Christians and non-Christians. Revelation can be overheard. It is in some sense public. Finally, what drew me into the possibility of Novak's account was reading the works of Isaiah ben Mozaga, a 19th century rabbi. Ben Mozaga provides an account of the Noahide as natural law that insists on a strict identity between natural reason and the Mosaic law, I think in a way reminiscent of Yoder's phrase picked up by Hauerwas in his Gifford lecture regarding those who bear crosses. Yoder remarks that those who bear crosses are working with the grain of the universe. That if there is any logical clue to creation, it can only be seen in the crucified Christ, in whom God is making all things new. Similarly, Ben Mozag insists that any inner logic at the heart of creation had to do with the pathos of God, God's passionate binding of himself to creation, not just his chosen people, but to Gentiles as well. There is no way on Ben Mozag's understanding to turn a natural law on Noahide logic against the actual demands of God's commandments, because God has sought to preserve Gentiles through legal structures as well. These Noahide laws function as necessary but not sufficient versions of the Mosaic law. Even Jews are not allowed to disobey the Noahide. In Ben Mozag, there's a rather unhelpful, I think, account of universal human reason. But like Hauerwas's grain of the universe, where any sense of a universal telos of humanity is grounded in the particularity of Christ, any sense of universal reason is grounded ultimately in the particularity of Torah. Ben Mozag's account allows him to have confidence there was possibility for baseline moral agreement with non-Jews, because human reason finds its ultimate telos in the divine law. This made me wonder whether there might not be parallel accounts for Hauerwas of baseline moral agreements with non-Christians. I mean by this not natural revelation, but whether there are better ways in which we understand the relationship between merely human forms of justice and their final telos in Jesus, the justice of God. You might wonder, I think this is dense stuff, and you might wonder what practical or pastoral use you could make of this. And here, in a section of my paper that I guess if I was Bart, it would be in smaller print. I want to talk about the story of Noah, because I think as I want to elaborate from the story of Noah, a sense of what does it mean to say that the law is the form of the gospel. As Rob Johnson allowed us to know, the story of Noah is dark. It is far removed from the comfortable pastels of the nursery. Instead, it's the color of moonless nights and dark, chaotic waters. The narrative context of the story is Earth's increasing alienation from the Creator God. In Genesis, ever since the first human sinning, the trajectory of divine-human relations has been ever-widening separation. And the grammar in which this alienation is expressed is violence. After Adam and Eve eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they are cast out of the garden. The woman is at enmity with creeping animals. Men and women are alienated from one another, with the latter subordinated to the former. They both become alienated from their bodies, which begin to suffer the weariness of work and the pains of childbirth. Death begins its undoing of all things. Men and women are at war with creation itself. Animals become sacrificial game. The ground actively resists creative labor. The land brings forth cursed fruits, and this sets the stage for the first murder. Cain comes before God with the bounty of the earth, and we are told that God rejects his offering. There will be no blessing for Cain's labor, and because of this, brother rises up against brother. After the murder of Abel, God addresses Cain. Where is your brother? Cain retorts with a rhetorical question, am I my brother's keeper? Most of us have been taught the answer to this rhetorical question is yes. Yes, we are our brother's keeper. However, Novak insists that the answer to Cain's rhetorical question is no. To be someone's keeper is to have dominion over them, like God has dominion over creation and human beings. The word keeper denotes someone who has been explicitly designated by someone else to look after their property. Am I my brother's keeper? No, in this sense, only God is. In fact, to be a keeper presumes that one human being has been given preeminence over the other. This is related to Novak, to the constant human temptation to see oneself as God's equal and as the absolute superior of one's fellow human beings. The temptation is in reality the most basic form of idolatry. This idolatry is intimately connected with violence and murder. In the immediate context, the text becomes yet darker. It is not entirely clear that Cain knew that he had the power, this kind of power over his brother. In this case, Cain might be rebuking God for his distance from creation. Either way, Cain's sin results in further alienation as he is exiled from the rest of humanity. From here, the story grows darker still. Humanity as a whole follows the path of murderous Cain. Humans build structures of order, but these are disordered or otherwise lacking. They arrogate themselves as gods over other human beings. Here it is fair to read the much discussed Elohim not as male angels or demons, but as political potentates. Politically sanctioned rape and violence reign. Enter Noah. Noah's name means pleasing, and he is regarded as blameless in his generation, and as a man who walked with Yahweh. Rabbinic explanations of the text have posed a very Pauline question: how is it possible to be righteous apart from the law? Textual commentators have focused particular attention on the phrase, in his generation. In one reading, Noah is not technically righteous, merely righteous in his own generation. Yet the threefold repetition of his moral status, righteous, blameless, one who walked with God, has led some to ask whether in his generation is not an intensifier of Noah's righteousness, insofar as he could be righteous in the context of complete moral breakdown. The moral status of Noah's generation is stated succinctly: great was human beings' evil doing and violence. Humans are described as such. Every form of their heart's planning was only evil all the day. The word that appears in the passage most frequently could be translated ruin. The ruined people were continually ruining a ruined world. And in this text, God tells Noah that he's going to finish the job. He's going to bring ruination. He is going to make his alienation and separation from the world total. The destruction of the world by God in the story of Noah is portrayed as something that happens not through God's active judgment, but through withdrawal. This is not a God that hurls thunderbolts. It's a God who exits stage right, lights out. The description of this judgment is exceedingly dark. Yahweh's act of creation in Genesis 1 had begun with a world that is described both as void and nothingness, and also as resistant void and active nothingness, a mass of violent waters. In beginning, God had separated light from dark, water from earth, dry from wet. And at the beginning of the flood, these barriers and orders and life-giving distinctions collapsed. God makes creation's lawlessness and orderlessness total. The water that had been separated from the earth in the form of a dome is allowed to collapse upon the earth. Light is extinguished, and in a haunting passage that describes the destruction of life, the text tells us that the breath of life is destroyed. The breath of the breath. All of life is destroyed. The tiniest bits of life, the breath of the breath. The language, the breath of the breath, echoes the language of Genesis 1, in which the breath of God, or the Spirit of God, hovers over the water, giving life to everything, separating light from darkness and creating the world. Here we have the absolute starkness of a world in which God has removed the life-giving powers of his Spirit, his presence, and his breath. The growing alienation between God and man has become almost and completely total. Earth has become a hellish void. And yet, in the midst of this world, utterly separated from God, a tiny boat rocks upon the murky waters of chaos. Here in this ark is a microcosm of all that is left. Ridiculous, of course, this collection of animals, clean and unclean. It is a kind of small copy of the entire world, a womb, an egg, a seed. A little boat in the midst of the watery deep, the deep waters of chaos. Here in this boat is the last remnant of God's life-giving breath. Here in a boat with its breadths and measurements decreed by God, its cubits and foots and pounds of food and numbers of animals enumerated by God himself, is the last place of God's love, of God's breath, and of God's preserving order in the entire cosmos. Noah is a man separated out from a world of idolatrous violence, righteous in his generation, preserved from the waters of uncreation. Once the boat lands on earth, there is a renewed separation between water and sky that once again bleeds light. Noah brings his thanksgiving offering to God, and just as God smells the pleasing offering from this pleasing man Noah, God comes to a sudden and startling conclusion, proclaiming, "I now accept that the human heart is evil from youth." It is a little late. A little late for the acceptance of human finitude and sinfulness. And yet, because of this, God makes a promise to humans. No matter how evil they become, he will never again withdraw his Spirit and allow the world to be uncreated by the waters of chaos. And God gives the people a series of commands prohibiting murder, prohibiting humans from eating the blood of animals, and providing basic moral codes. The covenant with Noah is an important part of how Jews understand their relationship with Gentiles. In Jewish understanding, God's covenant with Noah and the commands God gives to the children of Noah represent God's gracious concern for all humanity. Gentiles that keep these laws are considered, to some degree, righteous Gentiles. It is central to the Jewish notion that God is the God of everyone and not just their particular tribe. Here I think it's important to assert Brueggemann's argument that the point of this story is not the justice of God's rage. The story is not really about God's rage at all. Instead, the story is about God's dynamic about-face when he recognizes that humans are sinful and nothing can be done about it. If one is going to understand who God is, they are going to have to return to this story from the beginning. And it's clear that the point of the story is not how God intends to deal with human sinfulness. Instead, the story functions as a way of a negative, a way of describing how God is not going to deal with human sinfulness. Indeed, the phrase that is repeated again in the story, again and again, is never again. Never again will I open the portals of heaven. Never again will I cause rain to fall on the earth. Never again will I destroy the world in rage. Never again will I deal with human sinfulness through alienation, separation, and withdrawal. It is this never again that shapes the take-home message, which is that God has decreed that he will deal with human sinfulness with patience and grace. He will no longer react to sin by separating himself from humanity. Instead, God will deal with human sinfulness by binding himself closer, by drawing nearer, by becoming more passionately involved, and by taking up the painful job of becoming violent, ruined humanity's keeper. He will make promises, and the promises will have nothing to do with whether Noah is obedient or not. God's promises to never destroy the world, to maintain the regularity of the seasons. In the parlance of the Sermon on the Mount, God promises to keep the rain falling on the just and the unjust. The rainbow is the sign of this promise, standing in the heavens as a reminder of the regularity of the water cycle, as a reminder of the support beam, God's presence, God's breath that keeps the waters of darkness and chaos at bay. It stands as a marker of God's promise to keep the waters separate from the earth. An earth which now must be understood as an ark, floating through the void, marked off for God's care and protection. And at the center of this binding is the concept of law and God's promises to human beings. And God's promise to never abandon the world, to deal with the world with grace piled on grace that is new every morning, and regular as rain. But this grace comes to humans in the form of law. For the sign of total alienation from God was both the lawlessness that exists in the imagined world before Noah and the violent law that existed in the cities of Cain. God's grace comes to humans in the tiny ark of the law, in both the promises or orders and regularities that God promises to hold up, laws of nature, some of which are invisible to us. And it comes in the form of very basic moral law that can order our relationship with each other. Up to this point, this vision is very reformed, I think. I think where I as a Mennonite come in is to assert that the protection and care packaged in the form of the law is not the violent law of Cain's city, where men presume that they are their brother's keeper and violence checks violence. When one views the baseline morality of the Noahide commands in the context of the story of Noah, human violence is the grammar of alienation from God. Its origin is primal idolatry, a primal idolatry whose most potent expression is murder, and the creation of forms of civility in which some people are lords over others. God's command comes to Noah in the form of a call to choose life over death. The basic law has been read as an establishment of legitimate hegemony or state's prerogative over violence. But I think law in the aftermath of the flood actually is set against the logic of such a reading. God is not amongst humans who presume they have dominion over their fellow creatures. What Judaism calls for in the Noahide is not a status law, I don't think, or a justification for state-sanctioned violence. Instead, these laws demand cultural legal systems that respond to murder in an organized way. In this reading, the verse in Genesis 9, "He who sheds the blood of men, by men shall his blood be shed," functions descriptively. The vision of a world after Noah is consonant with law as a form of gospel or the form of divine command. Law is, in this case, paideia or educative and celebratory. Without a dynamic relationship with the God of Israel, Gentiles cannot fully participate in the freedom of the Torah or to be liberated from the terrors of idolatry. Yet by forsaking murder and the most primal idolatry witnessed in Cain, presuming to be his brothers, not to be his brother's equal, but his shomer, even non-Christian communities can sometimes participate. By not evincing the absolute justice found in Jesus, they can still have visions of justice that are somehow related intrinsically and not extrinsically to this justice that we Christians believe we know ultimately in Jesus. Thank you.
Is that on? Wow, Jodie, that's great. Thank you. I guess the necessary but not sufficient condition for me being here is Jodie, then her. Yeah. So Jodie invited me, and then I sent her my response, and she redid her paper. Terrible. This was mean.
No.
This is great. I guess I'm going to scrap a lot of this because a lot of my response was to your written paper, and so I'll
People have read it, Andy.
Oh, you've all read it?
Yeah. So you can do that. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
The context of here is
I guess some of what I would say, like, because I didn't write it down, is this necessary but not sufficient account of you have to have some sort of notion of what law is, some sort of notion of what a command is before we can hear what God says as a command. That's Hans Urs von Balthasar's critique of Barth way back, and Barth, of course, read that. Barth almost converted to Catholicism because of von Balthasar, so Barth agrees, and I definitely agree with that. So I think that there has to be some sort of spark in us, something in us, some divine image, something in us that allows us to hear, that allows us to see, that allows us to see goodness, that allows us to hear God, in order for us to even know what that is. The question is that some sort of natural law, and does Novak provide, does the Jewish tradition and Novak provide that in talking about the Noachide, which is drawn from Scripture already. It's already drawn from Revelation, so it seems already particular. How can that possibly be universal? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So that's like my kind of ad hoc, extemporaneous response to what you did is yes, amen. Also, John Howard Yoder, the other person you mentioned, I think he would agree with that because in the Christian Witness to the State, Yoder talks about how do we witness to the state from a Christian position? How do we not water it down with this natural law stuff? Yoder studied under Karl Barth. And he talks about there's a cloud of unknowing. There's just kind of these basic kind of things that we can somehow agree on a lot of times. But then there comes a point where there's a cloud of unknowing, and you just have to ask people to take a leap of faith, particularly when it comes to violence. Because violence seems to work at times. Violence is the habitus that we have, and so we have to sometimes call upon people just to take a leap of faith and try something new. But I think Yoder agrees with that too. So Hauerwas is right, and I also think Barth eventually came to the position that you're coming through by way of a Catholic. But yeah, the question for me is whether Novak.
You wrote a beautiful.
So whether Novak does that. So Novak sees natural law as tenuously grounded in Genesis' structure, since it starts with a common humanity that falls from grace and therefore needs negative laws to check our arrogance. These Noachide laws are basic to what it means to be human. Following them closely prepares the society to receive more positive laws that we see in the Torah and later in the Bible, in Leviticus and such. So, but only the Jews followed these Noachide laws perfectly and well, so only they were able to get these more positive laws. That's what I understand of Novak, right? One question I have there is, that seems to set Jewish people up in a in a certain very positive light, almost over other people. We have the true vision, we have what you need. We do it better than you, sort of kind of thing. For Novak, Christian ethics shares with Judaism a framework that recognizes how law undergirds community and spirituality, any relationship with God. So Novak engages with Barth it's kind of interesting that a Jew would ever even engage with Barth. Like, why are you even interested in all these internal debates within Christianity? So, but one of the reasons I'm understanding that he's engaging with Barth is because Barth, a theologian of grace par excellence, makes law the form of the gospel. He engages Judaism, he engages with this idea in ways that many Protestant theologies do not. For those theologies, Jews follow the law, Christians live by grace. And the two are mutually exclusive. For Barth, though, this law is the form of the gospel, and it's also part of the doctrine of God, whose, quote from Barth, "His function is to bear primary witness to God's grace insofar as this is the saving engagement and commitment of," in his sexist terms, man. Nevertheless, Christians and Jews think differently about law. This is how I'm coming at it. For Christians, the law serves a particular purpose, the law in Scripture. And even, we don't try to obey each law in detail in Leviticus. We make selective use of the law from the Old Testament. But for us, unlike Jews, Jesus is the new law. The New Testament repeats that. What does that mean, though? How can you follow a law that is a person? It sounds really unruly. It's not written down. It's not coded. So Jodie here, in her written paper, thinks that Barth has a problem with accounting for obedience on these bases. Because how do you follow a law like that? She says, quote, "Barth has the same kind of problem with the human capacity to imitate the justice of God as he does with the human capacity to obey God at all. It is hard to know," she keeps arguing, "how to structure our communal life so as to obey command, because Barth resists deontological forms. He resists this casuistry, he resists writing it down and making it coded." But I think Barth has a little more to say on this. Boy, I hate to be a good Barthian and defend Barth, but I'm going to kind of do it a little. No. In brief, I think for Barth, Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of God, came into the far country as a truly human being, which simply means that Jesus heard the Father and obeyed. So Barth defines the incarnation as obedience. Like that's what the incarnation is intrinsically, is obedience. So Barth was very concerned not to make law an alien note. In his context, Barth was trying to find a way to talk about law that wasn't Kantian, that didn't come from some universal reason that is within us. I think I should always act, Kant said, so that other people would act the same way and it would become a universal law. It's a terrible way to summarize him, but it's close. So on the one hand, within ourselves, the human reason, that can't be the basis of our law. On the other hand, Barth was trying to talk about law not being an alien imposition from the outside. So he was actually agreed with Kant. Law can't simply be, as Kant would say, law can't simply be something that's imposed on us from a foreign, alien, other world. Otherwise, we would never know what it is. He agreed with Kant on that. So he's trying to not go Kant's way, but he agreed with Kant on the foreignness of it. So right there is another Barthian agreement with what you were saying, that there has to be something within us. So instead, for Barth, Jesus is the law. He agrees. He tries to go with the New Testament. Jesus' faithful obedience, which fulfills the covenant of grace, establishes and defines humanity as a life of faithful obedience. Barth says, quote, "Obedience is the purpose and goal of hearing. Our return to obedience is indeed the aim of free grace." So obedience is central to what Barth has to say about what it means to hear a command, what it means to live a life of discipleship in Christianity. Therefore, our being, which only has existence in Christ, does not obey an internal law of conscience or reason, but obeys God's command. This moral space, as John Webster talks about what Barth is doing, within which we all move, is the obedient Son of God, whose humanity is entirely defined and sustained by his divinity. I don't think we can talk about what Barth is doing here without talking about his Christology and this anhypostatic, in hypostatic Christology, where Jesus' humanity is totally and completely dependent upon the divinity, the two natures. They're not on the same plane. Humanity is always sustained by the divinity. So there's on hypostatic It doesn't have being without the divinity. It's only in hypostatic, the divine. So his Christology is central to what he's saying about obedience, what he's saying about what it means to have law, what it means to obey. The command is really then about a habit. It's about a habitus. It's not about an external thing. It's not about our reason. It's about a life lived well. It's about a habit that is formed over time in the believer that becomes our own. It's not foreign. We're dealing here with character ethics, in my opinion. So Jodie also so that's one thing I would say about Barth. Jodie rightly also says that many Barthians in her paper are more concerned with worship life than social justice. I think that's mostly true. And Barth does say, that Christian ethics is oriented Godward in prayer and worship. That's where he begins his Christian ethics stuff in 3:4. First thing is prayer. That's ethics. Yet, for Barth, we are also oriented outward, otherward, horizontally. And he has a huge section on that. So the biblical individual, Barth says, is not selfishly wrapped up in his own concerns. We are oriented toward others. And in living this other-centered life, Christians follow Jesus. In the divine election, God elects to be for us. The ethical end part of God being for us is that God enters into active human life, which is capable of responding through God's call and command. God creates a covenant in which we do our part. Colin Gutton summarizes this very well. Election is not empty, but to something. For the Augustinian tradition, election tended to be to a particular destiny, to heaven or hell. But for Barth, election is to a particular way of life, habitus, a character. This way of life has a formed and contoured reference, is what Barth calls it. So it's not amorphous. It's not something that's that you can't predict. It's not chaotic. It's not. Yeah, it's something. It has a formed and contoured reference, and will take a definite shape. It's not written down, but it takes a definite shape. We can know consistency here with Barth. So Barth points to this general shape that God's command takes. It's always the form or shape or garment of grace. It is always a concealed repetition of the reality of grace and the promise of grace. This grace flows out of God's love, which could, I'm quoting Barth again, which could not equally wear other garments. God's command has quoting Barth, has a teleological power. That's a surprising word for Barth, teleology. He has a whole section where he says teleology is crap. And now here he's saying that God's command has a teleological power. The aim of the grace actualized and revealed in God's covenant with people is to restore the person to the divine likeness and therefore to fellowship with God in eternal life. The end of human life, then, is conformity into Christ's likeness. It can't be codified in a certain way. It's a form and contoured reference of grace. This determines our future and content of the command. In an important passage, Barth examines Matthew 5, quoting Barth. The well-known passage at the close of Matthew 5 shows us almost word for word what we have to say about the teleological character of grace. In it, the telos of the Heavenly Father is revealed in the fact that God vouchsafes rain and sunshine to all people, and therefore loves even God's enemies. This shows that the peculiarity of those who know and receive God's grace, in contrast to what the publicans do, must and will consist in the fact that they too love their enemies and are therefore teleoi, like their Father in heaven. It's a very important passage, I think, in Barth, about what grace means, about what the form and content of this law is of Jesus. So love of enemies has everything to do with the content and shape of God's command. It is involved in the telos of human life in being Christ-like. God's, quoting Barth, God's action is that God is gracious, and the person in their action is committed to correspondence to this action. This is the telos of the good life in Barth's theology, the good life. As God was in the world in Jesus Christ, so too God's people are to be in this world, as a sign of the Creator, reconciler, and Redeemer, a people who hear and obey God's gracious commands. So, I'm not so much, I don't really want to defend Barth like all the way, and boy, I don't want to argue about what Barth says so much, but what I'm trying to do is say that I think Barth's account makes more sense than Novak's in some ways for Christian theology. His character ethic makes more sense of Jesus to me than Novak's account of natural law. For Novak, theology and ethics come together. I read his book in response to Jodie's paper. I went and picked up one of his books and read it. I thought, well, this could be helpful for me. But he talks about how theology and ethics are inseparable. And he also says that the Noachian laws constitute a universal requirement of human reason. So one question for you, Jodie, and for the audience is, how do those two claims relate? So, and I don't want to focus there on the problematic appeal to human reason. I think that is problematic. But I'm more concerned with the purpose of law for Christians. The law's purpose for Christians is to sanctify people who have particular virtues. For Novak, the law's primary purpose is negative. It's holding back evil. So natural law has no positive function. It only has a negative function, it seems. But for Christians, I'm not sure about that. Is that really a step forward? Another primary problem, a more basic problem in my opinion, is Novak's use of Noachide law as a basis of universal human reason is this presupposition about what it means to be human at all. Underneath it all is an anthropology. Novak is looking for a common human nature, and that common human nature lies in reason. But does this really secure the rights of minorities? Does it actually? I know Novak, for example, defends the rights of Palestinians against the Israeli state, which is admirable for a Jewish person. But I still have to question whether that's actually going to secure their rights when it's all too easy to say, well, they are not acting reasonably, therefore, time and time again, it just slides into that thing. And underneath of all that is defining humanity almost always comes at the expense of other creatures, particularly other animals. Humans are creatures with reasons, unlike irrational animals. We can deny to irrational creatures the fundamental right to life that all humans share because they have no reason. So if you define certain humans as being irrational, they're not actually human. They're animals. We can kill them. But the more basic problem is you're killing animals. If you didn't kill animals because they're irrational, you wouldn't kill humans because they're irrational. So inevitably, some humans are going to get put into that category. So human rights nearly always presupposes the non-rights of other creatures. They do not have reason, therefore we can fill in the blank. Yet the Bible does not start with Noachide laws, but with creation-wide vision of peace, in which humans eat a plant-based diet. Humans don't live on the backs of other creatures, and creatures don't either. But let's just talk about what humans do. Humans have no mandate whatsoever to kill any other creature. The task of the dominion was right naming. Non-human animals are not meat, they're not fur, they're not leather, and they're not entertainment. They are covenantal partners, and they are kin. The politics of naming them rightly kind of matters here. So focusing on human reason in the Noachide laws tempts Jews and Christians to forget that the law forms humans into people with the virtues necessary to live as witnesses to a peaceable kingdom that Isaiah 11 and Isaiah 65 and even Genesis 1 and 2 witness to. Before Noah, we don't find a universal humanity, but a witness to a particular eschatological and original vision of peace. This is why Karl Barth has a section in Church Dogmatics 3:4 on non-human animals before he ever talks about, is it okay to kill a human? He talks about, is it okay to kill other animals? And many Barthians are like, oh my God, why does he even have that there? It seems weird. It comes out of the blue. I think Barth understood how basic that is because, he says, Killing another non-human animal without very good cause is murder, homicide. What is a good reason then? Is it taste? Is it tradition? They are thinking, feeling creatures with their own interest in survival, and Genesis and the Scriptures narrate them as God's beloved creatures, and we have almost no good reason to kill them. So the moral space that Jesus opens up beckons us to be witnesses to a far more expansive eschatological kingdom than even pacifist Mennonites like Jodie, and I used to be a Mennonite myself, envision. The Word became flesh. It's a broader term that the Old Testament uses for all living creatures, animal creatures, including humans. So to ground peace in Christology, just to take Bart a step further, and why not talk about God becoming a creature first in the incarnation, which is a more biblical focus than focusing on his humanity, the humanity of God. Then we can return to the Noah story, in which the violence of all creatures, the violence that all creatures perpetuate. God doesn't just send the flood because humans are violent. It's all creatures. So we can return to that story in which all creatures use violence that violates a fundamental aspect of what it means to have creatureliness, which is a theological term, not a universal one. This moral space that Jesus opens up and inaugurates, I would say, doesn't complete. He says, we will do greater things. Is indeed for humans, this is a moral space for us, but for humans to treat all creatures, all of us, as creatures of the same God with their own integrity before God. And that will secure the rights of minorities, far better than a notion of human rights, where we're always going to define somebody as not human somehow. We'll find the way. So this is a kind of narrative ethics, and it seems more satisfying to me than a natural law based on human reason. So.
We'll give Jodie a chance to respond, and then we'll open it up for questions.
I don't think, there's a lot of ways that I could go into your questions. The most curlish way would just be to say that Jesus ate fish after the resurrection. But
That's a good one.
Yeah. No, I did. No. But I don't. I don't think that. My sense is that Novak's account of human nature is based on reason. I think he's actually unique in his Jewish insistence that it is based on obedience, which is something different, I think. And I think it doesn't necessarily negate that an animal's life, for instance, could be ordered in very particular ways. And I think McIntyre is great about developing independent rational animals, all the ways in which animal life has forms of virtue and community and care that even put humans to shame. And so that you could say that the disobedience is a human problem, not an animal problem. So and obviously obedience is a more problematic. Maybe saying that someone's disobedient and they're outside of this, maybe more problematic. But I don't think universal reason is the function here. And I also think that when we're talking about obedience, my problem with Bart is and I think your account of Bart is beautiful, and I take this character ethics very far, except I don't take it with the way he reads the Sermon on the Mount. And I have a problem with the way he reads the Sermon on the Mount for just a flat-out question of genre. Because I think that the Sermon on the Mount are laws, I think they're commands, I think they need to be treated as commands, as statutes, as propositions, as all these things that Bart downplays in this scriptural narrative in other places. And I think when he's dealing with the Sermon on the Mount and he's reading it at this one point through the doctrine of justification by faith, and I think he does this when he says at one point to be a radical total pacifist and to be a total militarist are the same kind of forms of disobedience, because it presumes that you're going to have some kind of absolute way of knowing what God is going to command. I think that's deeply problematic on the level that we actually can see that God has commanded certain things in the Sermon on the Mount. This is the Mennonite speaking, right? And that to depotentize that absolute demand does nothing for, I think, the real beauty of recognizing, yes, Jesus fulfilled those commands. And I think the other thing is, I said this in the paper, and to me, that the relationship to some degree with the Sermon on the Mount and this question of obedience is this recognition that to some degree living out the demands of the Sermon on the Mount, you know, and I don't, you know, I've tried to do this in my own sort of, you know, very, very small ways because I haven't been called on to, you know, love a very radical enemy. But living out the commands in the Sermon on the Mount, or taking them as absolute commands that I have to obey, really forms me, these kind of events in something as a command, forms me in kind of recognizing what does it mean to affirm that God is so gracious. I mean, I think that there's no other way of really coming to this kind of recognition of God's absolute love for God's enemies, for his graciousness in the rain that falls on the just and the unjust, than trying to live out the Sermon on the Command. So I just don't want to depotentize them. I just feel like to some degree, I'm fine with, you know, I'm much more committed to character and virtue ethics than I am to any deontological formulation. But I just think Scripture demands that the Sermon on the Mount are deontology. They're law. That's what they are. So they demand a kind of absolute obedience. And can we obey them completely? No, and that's why, thankfully, Jesus has obeyed them completely and fully. But I don't think our only participation in these laws is some sort of character formation or participation in the Eucharist or some other, what I think is a dodge, finally. And I think that there's something about living under them in this kind of terror and beauty of them. So I guess that's how, I mean, that's how I'd answer some of those questions, I guess.
Well, let's open it up and see if there are any questions from the group. Okay.
Thank you. Jodie, I'm still not at all sure I understand what you're doing. So if my question is totally off the wall, just say, you know, you're totally off the wall and we'll do something else. Okay. But the more I listen to you, the more I wonder whether there's not in here somewhere, and I see a little bit of it on page 10, an attempt to rescue Yoder's, what little I know about Yoder's proposal for Jewish-Christian relations. Mm-hmm. And instead of locating those in a Jewish Jesus who actually becomes sort of, we'll all rally around this Jewish Jesus, becomes we'll all rally around the Noahide laws, and that becomes the way of getting this universal, this conversation that's not just communal but intracommunal. Does that make any sense to you? Is that?
Yeah,
I mean, I realize that's a tiny part of what you're doing, but that's the place where I thought, oh, I see, I think Yoder's much more of a figure in this paper than would be acknowledged just reading the footnotes.
So I tried to excise Yoder from my canon. And I mean, I'm honest, like I probably, like I have like a 40-page paper on Yoder and the Noahide thinking through these things. Wow. And and it's because of his particular life. Like, and I think it's, you know, like Yoder has this, the theologian Yoder has been found to be completely unfaithful as is sexually and an abuser sexually. And there was something here trying to think whether there's ways to not lid him out of the canon, but think through some of these questions without quite the way he goes through them, and whether there's something deeply problematic in the way he goes through them. I don't think that that's quite what I'm going. I don't think it's not necessarily. I don't think there's any real problem with having conversations with Jews that we need to be doing all of this strenuous gymnastics that I'm doing to some degree on kind of basic moral law. I think the bigger issue for me is how do we understand, especially for someone like me shaped by Stanley Hauerwas so much, is what does it mean to do justice work with people outside the church that don't have our sense of this rich telos, it's Jesus, the justice of God, or some kind of rich sense of telos, and in that. And we have a different view of what the, you know, in a sense that justice as in this rich kind of sense. And I don't want to take this kind of, I actually not trying to argue for a kind of a natural rights, liberal, distributive form of justice. I want to think if there's other ways of understanding the way these things can be related to one another, like baseline moral reason and the Jesus as the justice of God that don't require this kind of either or here, so that there can be baseline moral working together, if that makes some sense.
Let's go with Larry and then bring the microphone up. I think there are a couple of hands in the front here.
Larry Camphausen. I think my question is around a little bit around how we conceive obedience and law, and it also comes from a relationship I have with a rabbi, Rabbi Menachem Cohen, who's a alternative, emergent rabbi, mystical, and we've had this conversation around law and obedience because he feels that Christian language, and he has trouble with Novak's appropriation of Christian language about law, and he goes, for me, Torah is not law. The commands are not law in the way the English language we tend to understand it, that demands some sort of, as Andy said, external obedience, because that's how he kind of hears Christian language about it, especially Barthian or Calvinist. But he talks about Torah as way of life for him. Torah is the way. And then I start hearing Jesus when he says that. And so I wonder if maybe, I want to see if talking about Torah uncomfortably perhaps as a Protestant and somewhat Lutheran to give up the law-gospel dichotomy for a moment and say, if you see Torah not as external law, but as a way to walk in, as the psalmist says, does that kind of change the conversation even around what you're attempting to do with the commonality? So you don't need to get some large external construct, but that there are people that are walking in a way, and we can recognize it, and then we walk with them.
This is my sense of your question. What I'm worried, like it would be wonderful if we made something like this kind of exuberant, living, celebratory faithfulness of God that I think the language of command evokes, and law closer to each other so that, they disappear into one another. But what I'm afraid of, and I think that happens, is that it's the law part of it that we're so easy to fall out in how we imagine that. I think Buber does that to some degree. It's the strictures of the law. It's the form of that's so easy to denigrate. And I mean, and this is important for me, and I think it's important for me. Calvin has this sense, like, okay, if you stop worshiping God, you don't automatically, it's not like you're not worshiping anything, right? We're all idolaters. Something else is going to fill that void. We're all worshipers. And I think the same way. I think you can take law in whatever form you want and say, I'm going to get rid of that, or I'm going to minimize my way of understanding it. But I think something else, some other book of Leviticus, some other book of statutes is going to come in and fill its place. And my delight is to some degree that I think that there's more life and more fully engaging Jewish law than there is in the ways we've taken up state law or taken up some sort of practical psychology or something else. I just think, I guess that's my concern. So.
We'll bring it up to the front and then see if there's some questions on this side of the room. Okay.
Daniel Boyarin in his book A Radical Jew talks about, which is about Paul, he talks about how he has this a sense of the appeal of Paul's universal vision, and the appeal of the Christian gospel as a universal gospel. And he says the difficulty he has with that is that that universal vision means the loss of the particularity of his own life and experience as a Jew. And as I've thought about that conundrum that he presents, I was hearing kind of an undertow of that conundrum in the conversation we're having today. How does the particularity of the Christian faith then, which Bjorn sees in Paul as a universal reality, how does that particularity attach itself in any significant way, particularly as you've articulated, Jodie, with regard to the Sermon on the Mount? How does that attach itself in any particular way to a wider world in which those same kind of commitments? I mean, I guess I'm saying I have kind of the same problem that Bjorn does. If we're going to be universal, and particularly if you talk about something like a universal reason, then there's an awful danger that we end up losing the particularity of our Christian conviction, and even the particularity of the sermon itself, because we're asking people to live in a way that does not end up necessarily in Jesus for them. So in all this conversation about the universal scope of the gospel and the law, how do you see us becoming, as Christians, having our particularity and our understanding of law, right and wrong, and all those things, and yet communicating that particularity to people that don't have, the same orientation that we have? And that's been kind of an undertow that I've heard particularly in the conversation between the two of you.
Thanks, Jay. That's a helpful question, and it may be helpful for me to be able to clarify. I think one of the beauties of Novak's account actually is I think these basic formulas so it's basically a kind of way of thinking about, well, what kind of people can we have moral relationships with? Which isn't it's not meant to be exclusive. It's actually about looking at, there's all kinds of diverse ways that these laws are enacted in communal lives all over the world. And there's ways in which we can have real moral relationships with people that keep at least these laws. And I know it's not the barbarians as we usually assume that don't keep these laws. It's the barbarians like the British Empire that don't necessarily keep these laws, Or like in Bart's case, his account of Nazism. His account of Nazism as this kind of state that has become no longer a state of justice, but a self-justifying state. And I think the sense of, and for me, it means that we might be surprised by the spaces which we can have moral relationships with, and also by the spaces where we can have moral relationships. I think it's a way of, but what it is finally is a way of adjudicating like kind of moral systems, and where we can participate and where we can't, looking at these kind of baseline formulations. So I can see where for someone like for Ben Mosag in his Enlightenment context, he's wanting to say this is universality, but it's an odd universality at best. And for me, it's more like, if I can find richness in all kinds of different legal systems, and I can, you can then figure out ways of having interreligious, interlegal conversations then, if that makes some sense.
Two more questions. Stephen, and then anybody in the back there.
Okay. Stephen Chester. Jodie, thank you. Just really a basic question for comprehension, make sure I'm following what you're arguing. In terms of moral relationships with people in other traditions, when you're talking about the Noahism or the Noahide commandments, in this argument, are the specific commandments that are part of the Noahide commandments important in some way, or is this functioning as an analogy or a principle about how you would go about doing ethical reasoning?
Right. Probably that's a great question. I think it's probably a little bit wishy-washy at this point. I think for me, the fundamental one is this one about idolatry, which is, in Novak's case, is read through murder and violence in an interesting way. And I think the other primary one is this idea of having courts of adjudication. So having legal systems is really like kind of the implicit command that's part of all of these other commands. But I think about, Aquinas says at one point, like, oh, well, we might not be able to include a command against stealing in the natural law because we all know that the Germans are thieves, right? And you know, it's. I mean, I don't think it's that, but on a certain level, most of these things are involved to some degree in lots of across cultures, right? So I don't think it's a completely empirical project that every single culture has to have these particular laws, but I do think some sense of that there is a functioning legal system that adjudicates, especially in questions of violence, and has ways of dealing with that that's important for me.
I thought Stephen's clarification question was going to be about the barbarism of the British Empire, but thank you for not asking that question. Let's see if there's one more. We'll talk about this later. If there's one more question, I think we have time for one more question in the back there.
No, you can't take his question.
Who's that guy?
And I'm asking this question for those who don't know, as Jodie's husband and somebody who's co-written with her on this topic. So I suppose this
Not
is
this paper.
Not this paper, but on
Don't
other published
take any
work.
responsibility.
No,
at this point.
I'm not trying to take communal responsibility for this paper. In something that we did write previously, we spoke more about Robert Kober. And so this question is for Andy about the strong gap that you've made between narrative or character ethics and legal ethics. What's so important, I think, for me, especially with my particular legal background, is the way Robert Kober insists that all legal systems have a narrative attached to them. His most famous article is called Nomos in Narrative in the Harvard Law Review, and launched the law and literature movement. That there's no way of actually really completely divorcing a narratival ethic from a legal system, and it's a particularly, I think, Protestant movement to try and say a narrative or character ethic has got to be completely separated. And so, you know, I do think this argument about when we try and reject law as a whole, some other kind of Book of Leviticus, or, as Jodie said, self-help narrative, or systems of policing, or whatever you might have. If we try and reject the law tout court, and this has been true from Luther onwards, then we end up accepting some other form of law that is intimately related to a particular narrative. And so I suppose my question for you is, how would you see human community working in a way, as your particular form, you said you've moved beyond Mennonite ways of thinking, account for any space for casuistic or legal or nomological reasoning within a particular narrative?
Thanks, Doug. How do I think about legal stuff? Well, as an anarchist, I try not to, because I usually am on the other side of it all, in jail, and so that's the curlish way to answer, the dodgy way to answer. Sure, yeah, like law will have a narrative, and it'll have a character too, but what kind of character does it have? I think of like Jean Valjean and the other guy who was chasing him, some V. They had very different characters. One was very law-based. The other was very grace-based. Very law-based in a certain codified sense. You didn't follow the code, the written code, and I will follow you for the rest of my life and make you pay for that. And he suffers for that. And Jean Valjean, who, you know, sure, he follows law. You know, it's a different character. You couldn't codify the law he followed, you know, in a certain sense. It was based on grace, and he might do some things that maybe are illegal, but they were still based on grace. And I think that's why Barth would want to say, no, we can't make certain things into codified, because we might have to lie to protect Jews. You know, the Sermon on the Mount tells you let your yes be yes and your no be no, but we might have to not do that. And then there's the whole question also, the Sermon on the Mount is so particular, how can you actually make that a law without going bigger? So I guess that's what I would say, is something based more on grace, more on what Barth is talking about. And I do want to answer one thing with you, Jodie. The Jews ate fish thing. I'm going to answer that right now. That's an easy way to dismiss the whole thing about, human rights based on human rights. Means we're always going to define them some other way where they're less than human. But if you just start treating other creatures that way, not kill them, well, we don't have a problem. Not as much of a problem. But the whole thing, Jesus said, it's an easy way to dismiss the whole issue, in the sense of it may make what Jesus did a law, and Jesus didn't do that, for one thing. And Jesus didn't eat fish, as we define fish. He ate only what Jews would eat, which excludes almost everything you and I would possibly eat and call fish. If it had scales, if it had shrimp, any of that stuff, out. Catfish are out, that kind of stuff. And also, what does it mean to be faithful in our generation, just like what it meant to be faithful in Noah's generation, in a generation where 90% of the fish are gone? Doesn't it make more sense to act like Noah than Jesus? That's how I would act.
We are going to cut the session a little bit short. We're stopping about 7 and 8 minutes earlier. I'm going to ask Klein to come up to close this out.